Steve Sokol from Digium, and I'd like to welcome everybody to the Friday the 13th VoIP Security Webinar, a special webinar brought to you by Digium to cover the concerns regarding VoIP security in Asterisk and Switchbox. And today we've got presenting with us four extra special guests. We have Special Agent Michael McAndrews from the FBI, who will lead off. We have Dan York, who is he's the chairman of the Best Practices Committee for the VoIP Security Alliance, and also, I believe, a leader within the Voxeo Corporation. We have Jared Smith from Digium, who's our training manager, and we'll be talking about securing Asterisk and the specifics and mechanics of that. And we've got Tristan Degenhardt, who is the product marketing director for Switchbox, who will talk about Switchbox and how one goes about setting the security options for it. So I appreciate everybody joining us this morning. We're going to give a couple of more minutes. So far we've got 134 people in the webinar, and we're expecting somewhere close to 450. So we'll give probably 2 more minutes, and then I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Special Agent McAndrews. While we're doing this little bit of waiting, I'll give you some housekeeping tips. We've got the ability to raise a hand within the system, and if you're dialed in, you'll actually be able to ask a question by voice once I give you the sort of presenter baton. Easier still is to ask questions via text. The GoToWebinar system has a text chat option, and you can go in and either send chat messages, or you can actually ask questions through that, and they'll show up in the question list, and our presenters can join and sort of answer your questions. I see that a couple of you guys have already actually put some in there, so we will be going through and trying to answer those as we go. The presentations are expected to take right about an hour, and we'll have a little bit of question and answer from both Special Agent McAndrews and Mr. York. Then we'll go through the 2 specific presentations from Jared and Tristan, and we'll have kind of an open discussion thereafter for as long as people want to hang out. So that's kind of the way things go. I think since we're under kind of a tight schedule, I'm going to go ahead and get stuff started. Without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and Michael, if you are ready, I will go ahead and turn it over to you.
Very good.
Excellent. 1 second here, and let me get this running. And just to make sure, Tristan, if we're recording?
Yes, we're recording.
Awesome.
Okay, is that showing up for everyone yet, Steve?
It is for me.
Okay.
If I could have somebody text me or something if you're having problems, please do. But otherwise, we're going to let Agent McAndrews roll.
Excellent. Well, Steve, thank you very much. As Steve said, my name is Michael McAndrews, and I'm an agent with the FBI. I'm currently based in the Oklahoma City Division. I am assigned to our cyber squad, and our cyber squad handles pretty much any crime involving a computer. We tend to focus primarily on crimes that center on Internet technologies. That obviously is an emerging threat that we've seen grow over the past several years. And so today specifically, I wanted to speak for a few moments about the emerging trends that we've seen from our perspective regarding voice over IP and voice over IP fraud. My phone number is indicated here for the office, and my email address is indicated also. I want to make clear I'm not a voice over IP expert. I trust the panelists today are going to inform you fully on how to secure your systems, and with luck, we're going to help teach you a little bit of way to stop. Do not allow yourself to become a victim to any of the scams that I'm going to speak of in this presentation. However, anything I can do to assist anyone or anything needs to be reported to the FBI, feel free to use my phone number and email as you see fit. So, starting off, let me talk for just a few minutes here a little bit about the FBI and the cyber program. The FBI cyber program is actually broken into several priorities. Our priorities are based on what the director and the president and staff have worked together to determine the FBI needs to focus on. The top of those priorities at this time are computer intrusions. Specifically, we focus on national security intrusions first and foremost, followed then by criminal intrusions. We feel this is a grave threat to national security, also intellectual property and other such things. The folks that would conduct such intrusions are a grave threat to us, and that needs to be investigated. Voice over IP fraud specifically sometimes falls into this category, depending on what the malicious attackers are doing when they get a hold of a system. Sometimes the case can be classified as an intrusion, which gives it obviously a little bit higher priority. We also focused a lot of our efforts on innocent images. Innocent images would be referred by most people as a child pornography initiative. We're very concerned about crimes against children, specifically those targeting over the Internet, and those who would produce, distribute, or possess images of child pornography and trade them over the Internet, or those who would travel in interstate commerce to hurt children are obviously a big priority for the FBI. Intellectual property rights is a growing concern. Sometimes this will, as you see, touch the voice over IP arena. If somebody gets into your system and your particular data is exposed, be it through capturing of packets and voice over IP phone calls, or simply through using the voice over IP server as a hot point to get into the rest of your network, your intellectual property and your company's property are a big concern. So sometimes voice over IP investigations can run into those realms. And then finally, we have Internet fraud. And I believe a lot of the attendees are probably very familiar with Craigslist, phishing scams that we're going to talk a little bit more about, emails, and the like. Those, albeit the lower priority on our scale, are also given a lot of attention and by no means are disregarded. Oftentimes the crimes that we investigate cross all of these priorities. So it gives you an idea of where we're going. Now, voice over IP, as the folks from Jim and the rest of the panelists will tell you, obviously I don't believe we have to sell this to anyone. It's a great product. We've talked to many of the victims that we've worked with, and we asked them, hey, just so we know why are you exploring voice over IP technology? And the advantages come back consistently across the board as a cost factor, low-cost calling plans. Remote workers, oftentimes very mobile, need to be able to remote into the systems. It gives a common appearance quite often that if somebody's making outbound calls, they're coming from the home office. Unified messaging, converting voicemails to text and the like, along with call forwarding logic, all very easily configurable. So the bottom line consistently when we've talked to victims as to why they've chosen to implement voice over IP technology has always been cost, control, and flexibility. This is no longer where you have to go out and employ a large telecom to come in and put a giant box in the corner of your office somewhere to do a PBX. Now, based on software with some expertise, they can implement very easily a good solution that provides the cost control and flexibility that people are looking for. So, however, we've also recognized that when people implement the technology, there's always risk involved. And without exception, almost without exception, I should say, across the board, the number one risk that we found has been maintenance. This product, voice over IP, primarily is a software product. Primarily, they run on a computer system in somebody's office, and they are treated much the same as people would a computer. However, they are not always given the resources like you would a web server or a database server of some sort where somebody is actually managing it. So when we've gone into places and found that there's been an intrusion, very commonly we've found that the resources were not dedicated to actually update the software, to maintain security on the box, to patch the underlying operating system, and to give that resource the attention that it really deserves, much the same that they're feeding their web presence or anything else, which they feel sometimes is a greater presence because people log into the website every day, and they just do not realize the exposure that they have in a voice over IP system. One particular case that I've worked in the past few months, the voice over IP server that was found to have been compromised was managed by a contractor. However, that particular contractor had not been employed with that company for almost a year. Therefore, the server had been sitting without any attention for at least 12 months before we realized it had been compromised. The way we realized it had been compromised in that particular case falls into the second bullet point here, which is public image. The intruders attacked the voice over IP server and began making some phone calls utilizing a scam that I'm going to discuss later on, but they did not alter the caller ID function. Therefore, when the scam calls were going out, it was the actual victim company's name and phone number that was showing up on the caller ID to the other potential victims out there. So very quickly, complaints began coming into the FBI as well as other financial institutions saying, hey, somebody's calling from this company at this phone number trying to get my information. So public image becomes a big factor when, unlike your web page where people visit it daily and see it on the web, the caller ID feature starts to show up. People tend to associate that directly to your company, and the next thing you know, they're reporting you to blog sites, to law enforcement, and to Better Business Bureau, if necessary, saying this particular company is actually trying to perpetrate a fraud when, in fact, that company is indeed a victim. And then finally, because it is a newer technology, and the technology is still so new and not given the resources, it's a very tempting target for a lot of attackers. We're going to talk in a few minutes about some tools that are specifically crafted to target voice over IP systems out there, and they're having great success with it. So fortunately, through security webinars such as this, we're hoping that we can inform people that manage these systems and help prevent more victims in the future. So as we start talking about the scams, I want to make sure everybody's level set on one particular thing, and that is phishing. The anti-phishing work group actually defines phishing as a criminal mechanism employing social engineering and technical subterfuge to steal consumers' personal identity and financial records. In essence, somebody is using technology to scam you, to lie to you, to socially engineer you. Similar to a phone call asking for information, they're simply using some means of technology to do so. And almost without exception, in the criminal world, the target of these criminals is obviously your bank account. They want to get to your money. That's the point. They want to make money. And that's strictly a good old-fashioned crime. It's just a matter of using technology to do it. Sometimes, however, they may also be using the technical means to gain credentials to your network for more malicious means such as the intellectual property theft that I discussed, or potentially eavesdropping for not only intellectual property, but corporate espionage as well. We have found cases where the voice over IP server is simply an entry into the network, and once the people get into the network, then obviously they will try to exploit anything they can. All right. The first known cases for phishing appeared on our radar back in 2006. Since that time, I believe pretty much everyone has probably at this webinar received an email of some sort. It's not uncommon at all for a gentleman in Nigeria to inform you that you have a relative that has passed away. And with that relative, you can obviously, by help at providing your bank account information, help move your inheritance from Nigeria to the United States. I think most people are very familiar with this kind of scam. We've also seen when they originated a lot of websites, malicious URLs. Sometimes you'll find software programs embedded through scripts that are meant to get onto your computer and act as a Trojan to steal your information. Again, criminals are targeting your bank account information. They want to make money. They want to do what they can to line their pockets with your money and make you a victim. This increase, as you'll see by the graphic here, it drastically increased in December, beginning in 2008. The number of malicious code URLs out there is still just staggering. I don't have current numbers for you, but I can tell you that there's not a day that goes by that I don't receive a complaint of a fraud out there, of somebody trying to steal information through a phishing scam. What we are seeing, however, in the phishing scams is the evolution of SMS solicitations. SMS solicitations we commonly refer to as a smishing expedition. Smishing has become more common. There was a news article last night that I found here in my local newspaper and on the television that discussed people receiving text messages in the area with a local area code. That particular area code says your bank account has been compromised. Please call this telephone number as quickly as possible. We'll talk a little bit more about how that scam works in a minute. But because it was using a local area code, it was having some success. Fortunately, people are becoming more aware of this, and the Attorney General's office has tried to get the word out to people that these are scams. So, and secondly, the scams that we'll talk about too are the phone calls through the voice over IP, or as you're well aware, we commonly refer to those as phishing expeditions. So somebody came up with phishing one day. Obviously, it's catchy, so we're going to try to tag that to everything we can. All right. I said a few minutes ago that people have tools that are created specifically to target voice over IP systems. I'm not going to go into detail on any of the specific tools, but I can tell you that we have commonly seen at least three. Primarily, the attacks that we're seeing are focusing with voice over IP in regards to SIP protocols. SIP protocols, as many of you are aware, are obviously a little bit more platform independent. The SIP protocol is used by several people, and it's well known, well documented. The SIP Vicious tool suite, which provides a scanner, an extension identifier, a weak password exploit tool, and obviously a reporting tool, is well known to attack SIP phones and SIP extensions. There is a penetration testing company, Canvas, with their Immunity product that provides tool called VoIP, which will also test it. Now, these tools can be used, obviously, for internal testing to verify the security of your own system, but it's not uncommon to see them fall into the hands of scammers and people execute them over the Internet looking for a vulnerable system somewhere. And then the last tool is IAX Ping Poker. And IAX obviously was originally crafted specifically with the Asterisk systems, but I believe it's been adopted by others now, and the protocol has become more common. It's not immune to the exploits at this moment of looking for weak systems out there, so the IAX protocol is now also being explored more commonly. So let's talk for a minute about some specific attacks that we've seen. In the past several months, and by this I mean during calendar year 2009, we've seen two specific types of voice-over IP fraud. The voice-over IP fraud that we've seen, which is essentially a criminal act, is the compromise of the server to allow outbound telephone calls at the owner's expense. Now, this can be due to weak passwords on the SIP accounts. It can be due to poor security context in regards to who can make telephone calls. But regardless, if somebody finds an open door here and they enter to make the phone calls, their entire purpose is primarily to make telephone calls without charging themselves. We've seen these for calls coming into the United States. We've seen these for calls leaving the United States. We've seen a combination of such, but the number one goal there is obviously toll fraud. The second type of voice over IP scam that we've seen quite a bit of is the use of voice over IP systems to launch phishing scams. These particular phishing scams are going to be broken down into two subcategories just for a little bit more information. These particular phishing scams that I've seen most commonly involve either the compromise of the server to create inbound phone numbers for collection and forwarding, but this usually requires a collaboration with some sort of phishing email or, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, possibly a smishing text message that was sent out. The scam that I mentioned a minute ago with that smishing text message would be this type of fraud where somebody was asked to please telephone a phone number because of, in this case, their bank account was potentially compromised. Almost what happens here is somebody has compromised, typically a voice over IP server, and they've actually crafted an extension. By using a voice over IP server within the local area or with the area code that they have designated to this local area, people are more likely to call when they receive it and say, hey, it's a local phone number. When that call, however, comes into the voice over IP PBX, as most of you well aware, that call can be forwarded via the Internet to almost anywhere. It does not have to terminate locally. So getting someone to have a little confidence in the phone number is key here. Getting them to call is essential. That phone call solicitation can come through an email or it can come through a SMS message such as the one in this particular scam that was on the news here yesterday. So the compromise of the server to create inbound numbers for collection, that works. Now, similar to that is using the PBX to launch outbound phishing scams, but this one almost without exception requires the use of an automated attendant. Now, on the first scam, when somebody calls in, they can certainly be redirected to a live person if they need to, and that's not a problem. However, what happens with the outbound calls and the automated systems are usually calling you to alert you of a compromise of your bank account. One particular scam that we've seen here in Oklahoma involving a financial institution, a lot of customers in a particular area began receiving phone calls stating that it was their bank calling and that their account had been compromised. In order to verify that, please press 1 to transfer yourself to the security department. Obviously, once they pressed 1, they heard a ringing in the background and they were transferred. Not a live person answering the phone, but an automated attendant. The automated attendant said, thank you for contacting our security department. We have verified your account may be the victim of a compromise. Please enter your account number. People seem to trust automated systems more than they trust people. It's odd. But by initiating the number 1 to talk to the security department, the victim now feels empowered. They have now initiated an action instead of simply receiving it, even though the initial phone call or phishing message came to them. Now that they've committed an action in this process, they feel more empowered typically, and oftentimes will enter that account information onto the phone. After all, it's an automated system. It's not somebody with a foreign accent requesting it. Once they enter that information typically they will then be asked for the expiration date and or the PIN number to that account for verification. And oftentimes they will be then told, yes, indeed, your account was compromised. Please cease using your cards for a few days. We will send you a new one in the mail in 3 to 5 days. Sometimes, however, they're told, it's okay, your account is absolutely fine, don't worry about it. So depending on how the attacker crafts the social engineering aspect of the call, they can be led one way or the other. So the first calls, obviously, are outbound toll fraud. The second calls are typically trying to initiate an inbound call, and they use an automated attendant and people's apparent comfort level with automated attendants to try to solicit the information. Now, specifically in the attack I'm mentioning that happened in Oklahoma, they had not altered the caller ID, so people were very aware that when they got the phone call, and it was let's just say it was an unrelated industry from a far-off state that was phone calling, most people recognized it and felt uncomfortable and then immediately hung up and phoned their bank directly. The bank notified us, and we initiated an investigation immediately. And fortunately, in this case, I was able to actually call the company who had been victimized, speak to somebody who knew about the technology, and was actually able to start looking into the case while the fraud was still occurring and while those phone calls were still attached via voice over IP, so we could begin getting getting IP addresses to start the investigation. So it was key there. Now, I mentioned a few reasons why people are successful in these attacks. These particular attacks are successful because people tend to put faith in their caller ID. They tend to trust automated systems more than they do humans. And unfortunately, the elder clients out there, when they get a phone call from the bank, say, well, they had my name and number. They had my bank information. At least they knew who I banked with. They must know something about me. So they tend to be very trusting. And unfortunately, that's what people are preying upon when they're trying to seek this information. So from the legal aspects here, when the FBI investigates these crimes, we have two specific statutes that we usually employ. The first statute is Title 18, United States Code, Section 1030, which relates to fraud and related computer connection frauds there. This particular statute focuses very specifically on financial interest computers, protected interest computers, healthcare information, passwords, and that type of stuff. This statute is very, very commonly used with intrusions. This would be if somebody actually, in old school terms, hacked into a server. This would be the statute that we would usually employ. However, with voice over IP fraud, we also employ the wire fraud aspect of it, which is also a much more simple element to prove that you're using an interstate commerce vehicle, a wire, in this case it would be the internet, to perpetuate a scheme to defraud. So that particular one is a little easier. If it involves a financial institution, the crime can serve up to 30 years. It can pull up to 30 years. Otherwise, it will be up to 20 years imprisonment for the victim, for the subject. So finally, how do we report this? We encourage you, obviously, call your local FBI office. We take calls directly. Several of my cases, especially involving voice over IP, have come directly from victim companies. We're not out to publicize this. We're not out to get anybody bad press. Reporting to law enforcement does not mean you've lost control of your system. It allows us, however, to get into the case and start investigating. Is this going to be a targeted attack? Is this going to be a simple fraud, a criminal aspect, or what? And also, if you don't wish to call the FBI or your local police department, you can also report it to IC3.gov. IC3.gov is a clearinghouse for Internet-related crimes, and that will help provide an outlet to where we can get statistics and start helping get the word out even more. But regardless of whether you phone us or you report it online, the number one thing we need if we can't catch the crime occurring, as I did in that last instance I mentioned, we need logs, logs, logs. Please look at logging your systems. Please look at how you can identify who's been using your security context and how we can identify these people, because more often than not, it's going to lead us down a long chain of computers, and trying to identify who's on the other side of that keyboard is the key. So as many logs as you can provide to the law enforcement authorities, the better. So finally, with that, I'm going to open it up to questions for a couple of minutes. My information will stay on the screen, and I'm here for you.
Michael, thank you very much. That was great. We're open for questions, so either type them in and we'll get them answered, or raise your hand and I will let you talk. Just to let you know, the presentations will all be put up on the Asterisk.org website within the next couple of days. So if anybody had questions about the specific list of items that were mentioned, the different intrusion detection tools and testing tools, we will get those put out there. Looks like Juan Garcia has a question. So let me make you, looks like you're connected to audio. What do I have to do this? Let's see here. All right, we've got some questions coming in over the internet here. Look over the question online thing. So it says, can you still contact FBI if you're outside of the U.S., but the logs show the attack is coming from inside the U.S.?
Absolutely. Feel free to contact. If you've identified an IP address and you feel that the attack is coming from a specific geographic area, feel free to contact a local FBI office in that area. We have 56 field divisions around the country. There will be an office that handles everything. We do also, in I believe it's 50-plus countries around the world, have an FBI presence. And if you can identify them locally there, you can feel free to report yourself as a victim in that country.
Excellent. Another question, were the compromised systems that you've run across primarily directly connected to the Internet, or were they behind a firewall?
The systems that I've encountered have always been directly connected to the Internet. And when asking the companies why that would be, more often than not what we found is they've employed remote workers that needed access, and they did not, in their instance, use a VPN to provide that access. So to answer the question, in the cases I've seen, they've been directly connected.
Okay. I've heard of cases where an attack system was confiscated by law enforcement. What can you say about that, and how could it affect us in this case?
Whoa. There are no absolutes in these investigations. I can tell you from personal experience, especially with a victim company, we try to work very, very hard to not bring your business down in any way. What we are looking for, as I indicated, are logs and some sort of forensic evidence of who committed the crime. If we can simply get an image of the server, or you can provide a mirrored drive, for instance, that would provide the same content as the actual live server, that will usually provide what we're looking for. If you're being cooperative and helping us, the FBI is not out to hurt the commercial businesses, and we're not out to hurt the victims. We're trying to get the evidence, and obviously if we can't get it, that's going to hamper the investigation. But from my personal experience, no, we don't typically confiscate from a victim. We will, however, if we feel that the perpetrator was part of that company. We are starting to look more at what we would call the middlemen nowadays. And if we feel that you're part of the crime, then we're going to treat you as such, in which case if you're not cooperative and we need to use any legal means necessary to obtain the evidence, we will.
Very good. Marco Muta says he's from Portugal and has logged a number of calls going from Miami through Portugal to Cuba due to a lack of security on one box. He doesn't ask a direct question, but I suppose one should say if you're noticing that kind of thing, this is exactly the sort of thing that you'd report. Would the best thing to be contact the Miami region or field office?
Absolutely. In that case, if you have evidence that the calls are originating based at a box in the Miami division area, absolutely, that would be one of our top priorities. And again, we'd have to look at the motives of the individual, but if we determine that it's a national security situation, that would become one of our top priorities, and we definitely get in it right away.
Excellent. I'm getting a fair number of questions, and I'm not sure we're going to have time to answer all of them because we've got several presentations to go, but I'll throw a couple more of them out.
Sure.
Let's see here. Mark Peterson asks, can you still contact FBI if you're outside of the U.S.? Okay, we've already answered that one. So Marco does inform him that we do collect the IP addresses from where calls come from and do some logging, so that'll definitely help.
That's situation. Great. Good to hear. Very good.
Does the FBI have a site that lists tools used and known in scamming activities?
Not specifically for voice over IP or other frauds. There's a lot of private industry folks out there, and I'll let some of the other presenters talk more about the tools that are used, but the FBI doesn't typically provide the list such as that. We don't want to give anybody any ideas either,
Yeah. One more from this list, and then we're going to go on to Dan York. So let's see here. Is it typically Asterisk-based systems that you see compromised, or do you see other SIP servers and PBXs targeted?
I have seen more than just Asterisk out there, but I will say Asterisk is a leader in the voice over IP field from my experience. So it's not surprising to find a ready-made Trix box or something plugged in at a small to medium-sized company. Wow, well, right on cue.
Yeah. Well, Special Agent McAndrews, I thank you very much for taking the time to join us today. I'm going to collect the rest of the questions that have come in here, and I will probably be posting them. If you have time or inclination to be able to answer them, please do, and we will try and get that out to everybody as part of sort of an FAQ that we'll post along with this presentation when it goes up after the fact.
Fantastic. I want to thank everyone for attending today. It's definitely getting the word out there, and the folks that are using the systems, getting their help in securing them prevents more people from becoming victims. So if you do become a victim, we're here to help. I hope everyone, though, gets a lot from the seminar today, and I thank you for letting me attend.
You're very welcome. All right, next up we have Dan York, and I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to Dan. Dan will, I'm sure, introduce himself, but just to say he is the Best Practices Chairman for the VoIP Security Alliance. Tells you an awful lot on its own. So let's see here. Dan, you are now becoming the presenter.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Steve, for having it. And you should see the slides now, correct?
Yep, you are up and presenting.
Okay, great. Well, it was great to hear Michael's perspective on this, and I'll give an advance point to say that actually the VoIP Security Alliance does maintain a list of tools, and I'll have the URL here in a little bit. So to just sort of talk about what's going on here, what's happening, I am part of the Voice over IP Security Alliance. It's an organization formed back in 2005 to bring together people who are involved in the security industry and also in the voice over IP industry to kind of talk about what are the real threats and the real problems and also the real solutions. It was formed basically because there were a lot of security vendors running around saying, you know, VoIP is inherently insecure, it's the end of the world as we know it, but if you buy my box, I'll be safe. And there were a lot of VoIP vendors at the time running around sort of saying, it's all those security nutballs, it's really not a problem, don't worry, just be happy. And VoIP was trying to say, was formed to say there are real problems, but there are also real solutions. And so I'll talk a bit about that. I also was the creator and co-host of a podcast called Blue Box, the Voice over IP Security Podcast, which you can find at blueboxpodcast.com. And my co-host and I did about 3 years' worth of shows and all sorts of information. We've been kind of quiet for the last year, and we may or may not start doing more shows, but it's out there with a lot of content and interviews around voice over IP security in general. As Steve indicated, I'm also a member of a company called Voxeo, which is based in Florida and provides a platform for automating phone and communications applications, developing apps from large-scale IVRs and conferencing systems to Facebook conferencing apps and kind of everything in between. So that's what we do, and I head up the marketing team for that organization. But the issues that we've certainly seen within the voice over IP security space or in the security space in general, are certainly well known. I mean, privacy available. You can see things here. We've certainly seen these issues. The noise around voice over IP security has been quite prominent over the past several years. As Michael mentioned, the vishing and some of the phishing and the other pieces that voice over IP doesn't necessarily bring about itself, but it makes easier in many ways. And there's certainly also a number of information in the larger security community. The SANS Institute, which puts out its top 20 security risks, has identified voice over IP as one of its top threats for the last couple of years. Now, this is also, I mean, to be fair, it's broad categories. I mean, Windows, Linux, things like that are also on the list. But it also just points to the heightened adoption of voice over IP in general. There's a lot of tools, not just the SIP Vicious and VoIPAC and the EEX Ping Poker that Michael mentioned, but a lot of other ones that are out there. And I'll have a link to again a list of a lot of the tools that are out there people need to be aware of. And what the Voice over IP Security Alliance did about it's a couple years ago now was we put out a list in large part because people who were trying to defend their systems and test their systems weren't aware of what all the tools were. And so we put it out there so people could be able to know, because the reality is that the attackers know where the tools are and what they're doing. And so we want security professionals to be able to know what was there and how they could use the tools to help with testing their own systems and ensuring their security. There's a lot of books out now. There's actually even another one that I should put up on this list that I've been aware of lately. But there's a lot of good books that really go through how you can secure your VoIP networks. One in the middle there, the Hacking VoIP Exposed, actually walks through Cisco, Avaya, Nortel, and Asterisk systems and talks about, how you can attack those. And really, attack and defend are just really, it depends upon the difference in the color of your hat, really. And so it's good. They're good information. You should be aware of them because the books are out there. People can read those and work them. The big challenge really in voice over IP is that the security of systems in the old days, in the world of TDM, the traditional PSTN, the traditional phone system, it was pretty simple. The security was there. You just secured the switch. You kept people with butt sets and alligator clips away from the wiring. You changed the voicemail passwords, and generally you were pretty set. It was, all in all, a fairly simple matter. The problem is that with voice over IP security, it's a much more complex proposition. There's a lot of different components. It's no longer that you just simply call one vendor. There may be a range of vendors that you have to be involved with. And also, as you get into larger companies, you get a lot of finger pointing. It's the firewall people or the server people or, it's a lot of different people are involved in that. So it's not necessarily a clean and simple thing. It used to be you could just call somebody, call the vendor of the phone system, and they'd come in and do something. Well, now, it's just sitting on a server somewhere, maybe under somebody's desk, and it's linking into everything else. And especially in the case of Asterisk, it may not even have a specific owner, or it may or may not, depending upon who's, the size of the organization and what's being involved with it. And that's really kind of the larger comment I'd make is that as we move into what we call unified communications, whatever we want to refer to it as, it's all about an ecosystem of products. There have been a couple of alerts over the last couple of years where I remember one that it's now been a number of years, but there was one where there was a Rolodex application basically that when used improperly would cause an Asterisk system to crash. There was another one where if you were using basically a messaging store that was putting your voicemail messages into an IMAP mail system, if an improper message was sent in the correct way, it would wind up crashing your phone system, crashing Asterisk. So you get into these wacky things as we extend more and more capabilities into this larger communications, mechanism, this system, where pieces that are on the edge may wind up impacting something like Asterisk. So it involves a lot more thinking around what are the pieces that are connected into your system, what are the pieces that are out there, and what do you have to worry about, who are you, who's responsible for it, what are they doing there. So I will say, though, that I do believe that you can have more secure voice over IP than the PSTN if you do it properly. And that's the big if there, because there are capabilities. I am talking to you on a teleworker set from an office in New Hampshire. It is going over a secure encrypted connection down to an office in Orlando, Florida, where my company's based, and then from there out to the PSTN. And it's going across secured connections and secured lines. But if it were not done that way, if somebody had not known how to do that, it could be very insecure. So, but on the other hand, I have an encrypted end-to-end connection, or at least end-to-gateway connection, which is more than I ever had on the public switch telephony network. So let's talk a little bit about security concerns in general. We've always had concerns in telephony. In history, we had, of course, the blue boxes, with the in-band signaling that would get you free long distance, et cetera. This is actually a picture from the Computer History Museum, and actually a little bit of trivia. This is actually a blue box that was created by Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, but a little fun thing on there. We've also been trying to prevent these types of things. There was a product called the Hushaphone that was a silencer. You can see here you would put it over the old candlestick phones, and you would have privacy, et cetera, and all these. So we've been trying to protect against these kinds of threats. When you look at what we have to be concerned about, we need to look at the media and the voice. It's kind of the most tangible one of eavesdropping, etc. Call control, the public switch telephony network, management side, and then the underlying network. And I want to talk about each a little bit. Before that, though, I think it is important to talk a little bit about how SIP works, because that's the open protocol that most folks are using for a lot of the communication, and how that sort of comes into play. In general, when you have two SIP phones, you have Alice calling Bob in the proverbial pattern here. You have SIP going from Alice's phone to a SIP proxy going to another proxy and then down to Bob. And then you often have the RTP, the voice media, streaming directly from Alice to Bob. Now, Asterisk changes this a bit, because Asterisk will have the RTP streaming into the media server in Asterisk. It will not necessarily stream directly from endpoint to endpoint. But this is the general flow that you see, and of course, this could be across an internet or WAN type of connection that you would have. So when we talk about media, the big concerns are certainly eavesdropping and degraded voice quality. You know, there was when I was working at a previous company, I was involved with some security scans and some security, analysis as you went into large-scale RFPs. And a security team at one point said, if I'm pumping 20,000 packets a second on our local network, the voice quality degrades. And I sort of said, well, yeah, but if there's 20,000 packets a second going on your network, there's a larger problem on that particular network segment than just the voice quality in some ways. So there's the typical kind of network things we need to think about. Packet filtering, virtual LANs. VLANs are not they don't necessarily provide a overall solution, but they provide one mechanism of helping prioritize something like voice traffic over the other data traffic. And I mentioned encryption here. And encryption is, when implemented correctly, it doesn't solve all problems, but it solves a number of them and makes a number of other problems much harder. So it's certainly one way to go and do that. Encryption in the media, most people at this point are using something called secure RTP or SRTP, which is a quick and lightweight way to go and encrypt the RTP stream while also being extremely secure. And so you're seeing that happen out there. On the signaling side, I was struck with comments Michael made about toll fraud, about impersonation, caller ID spoofing, all of those things. Call control, signaling, especially in the SIP world. Now, this is not true exactly of EECS, but on the SIP side, it's all in the clear. It's all like email, essentially. It's an HTTP-like protocol. It's all ASCII text. And so if you can intercept the call, if you can get in the middle of the call, you can certainly modify it in transit. So there are issues there that you need to that go back to needing to protect the integrity and the confidentiality of the signaling stream. There's also the availability issue, making sure that your SIP server is available and that there's some kind of alternate, or availability that you've got redundant connections, whatever it may be, so somebody can't just go and launch an attack against your SIP endpoints or your SIP server and be able to take your network offline. Again, encryption is one mechanism. A lot of folks are using TLS encrypted SIP, which is SSL. So TLS, it's like SSL. TLS encrypted SIP is one way that people are doing this. There are people using IPsec for tunnels that just tunnel the whole thing. There's different theories around that and different elements. One issue with IPsec is that it often tends to be a bit heavyweight, and so you wind up creating a lot of extra traffic. One of the issues with SIP, and actually I shouldn't say SIP, with voice over IP in general, is that it has a lot of little tiny packets. So when you take, on the media side, when you're streaming media, you're generally chopping things up into very tiny little packets and sending those off. And so it can create a lot of overhead with some of the encryption techniques, which is why a lot of people use SRTP on that side. On the signaling side, a lot of folks are using TLS encrypted SIP. One challenge there is key exchange, is getting the encryption keys from one end to the other. And in a single vendor environment, it can work well, but when you have multiple vendors, it can be a challenge. There's a couple solutions out there that people have looked at. One is from Phil Zimmerman, is ZRTP protocol that's been around. Another solution that the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, is promoting is something called DTLS SRTP, which essentially is datagram TLS in the SRTP stream. So it's some things that are happening on that regard. I mentioned here encrypted phone software. There are challenges out there. A lot of the phone sets will go and load their software or check for updates using protocols like TFTP, the Trivial File Transfer Protocol, which just goes and downloads an image. And if you can get a phone, if the software is stored on a server locally, and if somebody can compromise that, it is possible to trick a phone into downloading software that would have some kind of rogue information in it that could potentially be, for instance, sending signaling back to another site or something like that. The management side is an interesting one because a lot of the phones, a lot of the IP phones, they're not just little pieces of equipment with buttons and lights on them. They're computers, and so they have services running on them. They have passwords, often default passwords that were used to provision the phones, and then people forget to go and change them. And you have to think of every little phone out there, every IP phone, as a computer. You have to think about it as what are the default passwords? Have they been changed? Do you need to patch the phone systems or the phones themselves? What are they running? Are they running non-essential services? A few years back, Sean Merniger, a security researcher, did a look at Wi-Fi SIP handsets and found that some of them had SSH servers running on them for administration. A couple actually had a Telnet server running on it. One had a POP3 mail client. All sorts of stuff that just doesn't need to be running on a phone per se. So you have to look at your endpoints, look at what's there, understand what the security risk may be. You also, in this day of unified communications and creating this ecosystem of applications, we have a lot of application programming interfaces, APIs. And one of the questions is who can access that? What kind of connections can be made to it? All of those different issues that you need to be thinking about it and understanding, again, what are the risk factors that you need to look at. And management interfaces, who has that? The other issue is, the public switch telephony network. Toll fraud, as Michael mentioned, is an issue. It's probably the most expensive, the easiest, or the most expensive financial issue that we have, the security threat. And a lot of newer players out there, are struggling to spell PSTN. They know about IP and they know how to work with that, but they don't understand, what kind of connections or what would happen if you leave your, voicemail open. You just use default passwords that people can easily go in and reprogram it to allow you to direct phone calls out onto the network. It's a common issue that people have used out there. Another challenge with voice over IP, which is also its opportunity, is that there really, are no geography issues, because I can be, as I said, up here in New Hampshire talking on a phone that is connected to a system down in Florida and on from there. It's both a strength as well as a weakness. As Michael mentioned earlier, a number of folks, rather than having some kind of secure teleworker solution that would allow people to provision external phones, they would just put the IPPBX or whatever device directly out onto the public internet without any kind of hardening, without anything like that. So if you are going to do that and make use of remote workers, you need to be sure you have some kind of remote teleworker type of solution. Generally, they come in two flavors. Most of the teleworker solutions I've seen involve something that has a secure SIP connection, a TLS encrypted SIP connection, going back to some kind of server on the edge of the network, and then they're using SRTP again for connection back to, again, some device on the edge of a network. There are a few vendors out there who have gone and actually embedded an IPsec client into the phone itself, the IP phone, and they've gone and had that connect back there. And then when you talk about soft phones, again, it could be a soft phone either using direct connections from the soft phone software itself or coming in over a VPN, an IPsec or PPTP or whatever VPN you're using on that. So things to think about in there. I want to spend a couple minutes just about SIP trunking, because it's a pretty incredible part of what people are using voice over IP for, to get the PSTN connectivity, because I can be running Asterisk or any software in my home, and I could be able to use SIP trunking to have PSTN connectivity out to the larger world. The challenge, of course, is if you're running that SIP trunk over the public internet to a SIP service provider, you are sending your call signaling, and potentially your media is all going across the internet in the clear if you're not looking at how to go and secure that. If you're using a carrier's network, the same network, for instance, that provides you with data or your internet connection, then very often, they are a little bit more concerned about security, and so they will, because it's on their own network, but you're often paying a higher price to use their SIP connections. So you may typically be looking out across the public internet. So you have to be concerned. Now, I shouldn't say it's trivial to get to that connection, but it is not non-trivial. I mean, somebody who can get in between where your IPPBX is and where the SIP service provider is, somebody who can get in that path can be able to see your call traffic and your media path. So in this era of compromised servers, botnets, all of those things, the potential's out there. It may be challenging, but it may be there. One advantage of SIP trunking I'll mention is that you have a lot of capabilities for business continuity and disaster recovery, because from your one IPPBX, from your Asterisk box, you can connect up to multiple SIP service providers. And you could have a whole slew of them if you wanted to provide you with geographic redundancy and connectivity that could get you inbound or outbound calls, so that in the event that one of your SIP service providers went down, you would still have connectivity coming through other providers. I want to move on a bit. Cloud is all the buzz these days, and again, because we have this lack of geography, this doing away with the connectivity, and we can really do massively distributed networks these days, where you can put some of your functionality on premise, you can have some of it up in a hosted environment, and some or all of that. You do have to think from a security point of view. You have to be thinking about, how do I secure this? If I have a local IPPBX that's connecting across the internet to some kind of application platform or some other hosted service and going out there, or if I'm using, all of my phones are local, my soft phones, and they're going out to some kind of hosted service, what's the security of the link between my on-premise devices and my hosted system? What does that look like? What's the security of the data? All of those different types of issues. And mostly a lot of it's availability. Can you trust that the cloud will be there? And I mentioned some questions here, and the slides will be available afterwards again as far as what kind of availability, geographic, network, physical redundancy, all of those questions. What are those? What's the security of what's out there? I want to finish kind of talking about the threats with spam, or SPIT as it's referred to, spam over internet telephony. And if you think about what a traditional telemarketer needs, the person needs for an IPP or a PBX, a phone connection, all of those. And there's a certain amount of latency. There's a certain amount of cost. Now, the challenge is as we move into voice over IP, those costs go away for a large part. They can take Asterisk, they can run it on their home system, they can get some very cheap SIP trunk connectivity, and they can be able to go and make the connections out across the internet and make a lot of calls. As I say here, it makes for great headlines. It's not yet a significant threat. We're seeing it in certain places. And, the fear is that there's a tool that just goes and iterates through SIP calling addresses. And, in fact, on the list of tools that I'll show you, there is, in fact, one of these tools that will work with Asterisk to do precisely this, to go and do this kind of automated war dialing, basically. The general reality is that most companies do not allow direct SIP connections. Most of what's happening right now is that SIP chunking, SIP out on the internet even, is used for PSTN line replacement. So it's going, instead of installing PSTN direct connections into your office, you're using an IP connection out to a SIP service provider who's doing the PSTN connectivity for you. So the reality is that we're not generally having direct connections. But as people start to do more, as they start to federate, as they start to go and do that, and we get to the point where incoming calls are allowed from any other IP endpoint, as we get to that time, we have a larger challenge here, or will have those challenges if we aren't looking at ways to deal with this. Until then, the PSTN really serves as a firewall in many ways between us, which is kind of ironic. But anyway, what I mentioned before, the Voice over IP Security Alliance, we have a number of different projects. We have a mailing list, voipsa.org/voipsec. We have a blog, podcast. We have a document out there called the VoIP Security Threat Taxonomy that was created in about 4 years ago, October 2005. sadly, it's still the same list of threats that are out there. But we created a document, a PDF you can go and download, which really lists the threats to voice over IP. We did that in large part because every vendor was running around with their own separate list of what the threats were, and so we wanted to have kind of a neutral one. I am charged with getting a best practice project underway, and at some point we'll be working with that a little bit more. I mentioned the list of tools. It's up here, voipsa.org/resources/tools.php. It's got a long list of tools that are out there with links to them that you can go and see. Not only the ones I put on the slide here, but there's a lot of other ones. Many of them, yes, are designed to work with Asterisk. And they do fall into a wide range, tools that will enumerate all the SIP endpoints. They're tools that will go and do fuzzing, do attacking of the SIP protocol or the EEX protocol, some of the other ones. There's also some interesting tools, too. There's things that will go and if you can get to the point in the network where you're between the sender and the receiver, you can do things like, intercept and modify the media stream so that you could, for instance, mix in other background noises. So somebody is calling somebody and you mix in the sound of a dog barking or whatever other interesting sounds you want to go and do. And the ironic part about that attack is that the person calling, of course, has no idea because they don't hear it. It's just being mixed into the recipient's media stream. So there's all sorts of things that you could do if you can gain access to the stream. So they're out there. The tools list there. I mentioned some items here. I also mentioned a couple of other pieces. There's a document that the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the United States came out with. It's about 4 years old, but it's still good. It's called Security Considerations for VoIP Systems, SP 800-58. And what it does is it provides a good tutorial on what some of the standard protocols are, SIP as well as the older H323, what the issues are, what you need to be thinking about as well. The other one I'll mention is network security tools. VoIP. With VoIP, voice is just bits across the wire, and so everything that you do in normal network security is now a concern that you need to be thinking about in terms of voice. I'll also mention the Hacking Exposed VoIP book, which I know the authors of, but not to be biased among books, but I know that they put this site up along with a number of tools, including some tools to do things like look at find IP phones using Google and other issues that are out there. So it's a site to take a look at as well. And I would again say that I think you can make VoIP more secure if you do it properly. And I will leave it right now to say let's have some questions if there are any. And you can go to voipsa.org. Again, you're welcome to contact me as dan.york@voipsa.org. So back to you,
Thank
Steve.
you very much. Awesome. I've got a bunch of questions here, and we'll probably take 3 or 4 of them because we're running a little bit late, but that's fine. We got a lot of good information there. First, somebody asks, does changing your SIP port away from 5060 for external endpoints do much to increase security?
No. I mean,
yeah, it sort of struck me as the old security through obscurity thing, and it's not very obscure if you just move it a few numbers away.
Yeah, and then you're creating all sorts of headaches on your end to go and reconfigure all of your endpoints, and then you're also going to not be able to communicate with other people who want to communicate with you via SIP, and a scanner will find it anyway, and some probing will figure out that it's SIP or something. So I would not do that.
Okay. Next, Joseph Burdick asks, are there established SIP trunking providers that provide SRTP or something besides open/clear media signaling?
Yes, there are a number. Increasingly, if you go and talk to some of the SIP service providers, they're at least aware of the issue. I queried a number. There was a panel at one of the conferences about 2 years ago, and there were 8 providers up on stage, and I asked them why they weren't doing it. And one of their comments was, well, because nobody's asking us, which was a cop-out in my opinion. But anyway, that was what they said. But there are a number of the larger providers, if you go and ask them, they will do that. There are also a number of smaller providers that I've seen talk about providing secure SIP and SRTP as a way of differentiating themselves. So they will give you secure connectivity. So there are certainly, I wouldn't limit yourself to looking at the larger players. I'd also look at some of the other smaller folks out there as well.
Excellent. One more question, and then we'll go on, I think, to our next presentation. But someone asks, how do we protect the phone conversation when using a provisioning server where the phones pick up their configurations, as in hosted PBX? So I'm not quite sure. Maybe that he's asking, how do you actually protect the provisioning session to make sure that nobody is basically sniffing information out during that process?
Yeah, and so if I thinking of what the person's asking, in many of the hosted environments, if you had an IP phone on your desk or something, it will have a local copy of its software that needs to start up, but then it will go and check for a new copy, or some of them may just boot entirely off of an image it downloads from a provisioning server. And so that goes back to the question I mentioned in there as far as, I would ask your vendors around what are they doing in terms of, I know some of the vendors use encrypted software loads. So in the provisioning server, the phone will go and download it, and it will download it, but it's been securely both encrypted and digitally signed so that the phone knows that it has not been tampered with, and will load that up and be able to use that software load. Now the other aspect, though, so that's getting the software on there. I know some environments also have phones that have the software all loaded, but then they go and they connect to a server to download the information on what extension they are, what's their caller ID, all the different pieces that are part of things, what their SIP gateway is. And on those, again, I would be talking to the provider about what is the security of that session. Is there, is it TLS encrypted? Is there something? How is it downloading that configuration data down to the phone? It can be done securely, but the question is really, is the vendor doing that?
All right, very good. Well, I think it's time to go on. I appreciate, Dan, all the information that you presented with us, and I'll be putting your presentation up along with Michael's at the end of this presentation so that everyone has access to it. Well, but thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
All right, next up, I'm going to turn things over to Jared Smith, who's the training manager at Digium, who's going to talk about the practicalities of securing an Asterisk system. So without any further ado, here is Jared.
Thanks, Steve. Get my presentation up here. All right, again, my name is Jared Smith. I'm the training manager here at Digium. And first of all, I just want to thank Michael and Dan for great presentations on what are the risks and the threats out there related to voice over IP. And I'd like to go through and talk about how you could secure your Asterisk-based systems and make them so that you don't become victim to some of the scams that are going on out there. The goals and objectives of my presentation here: one, understand the security threats and risks that are out there, and then two, talk about kind of the concrete things you can do to harden and protect your Asterisk systems, and then learn how you can keep up to date and keep on top of security developments related to voice over IP and Asterisk. I think Dan and Michael have done a great job of enumerating the threats and the risks out there, so I won't spend any more time talking about those, but there are a number of different threats out there, and you really need to take a holistic view of security and network security, things like eavesdropping, voice over IP phishing or vishing, denial of service attacks, all those sorts of things out there. What I really want to get into in today's presentation is 4 concrete steps that you can take to help protect your Asterisk or voice over IP systems. Those 4 steps are: 1, check for weak accounts. I think that's the number one thing that people are encountering these days is accounts that people are breaking into to make phone calls on your nickel. Other things that you can do: number 2 there, know your dial plan and be careful about the way you script your dial plan, and we'll go into more detail on that as well here. Number 3, limit your network exposure. And Dan talked about some of these sorts of things with things like VPNs and encryption and things like that, but there are concrete steps you can take from an Asterisk standpoint to limit your exposure out there on the network. And last but not least, common sense, just keep informed and keep up to date on the changing landscape. So let's go into a little more detail on some of these. First of all, checking for weak accounts. Again, toll fraud and unintended use of a voice over IP system like Asterisk is probably the most common problem we see today. Make sure that your passwords are long and complex. make sure you don't use all numeric passwords. There are a number of kind of third-party add-ons to Asterisk frameworks and GUIs and that sort of thing that have a bad habit of creating an account with a username of 1001 and a password of 1001, and a username of 1002 with a password of 1002. And it should be pretty obvious that that makes it very easy for an attacker to guess what your usernames and passwords might be and authenticate as that user and make calls through your system. You may want to use what we call access control lists to limit connections to certain network addresses or network subnets. An access control list is simply a list of IP addresses or IP subnets where you will allow calls to come from or registrations to come from or block those as well. And we'll show an example of that here in a minute. The other thing I want to point out on the toll fraud side is just you want to check all your channel drivers, whether you're using the SIP channel driver or the EEX channel driver or H323 or MGCP, whatever voice over IP protocol you happen to be using. You want to check all those accounts and make sure that they've all got good strong passwords, good usernames, and you may want to go audit your list of accounts there for any accounts that no longer need to be active. Oftentimes, if employees get fired or let go for some reason, or if you set up accounts for testing and forget to go back in and take those out, you're opening yourself up to potential problems there as well. The other thing I want to point out on this slide, check the Asterisk Manager interface and check those accounts as well. Make sure that those are secured. If someone gets into the Asterisk Manager interface and has access to those APIs, depending on what level of privileges you've given there, they may have access to create new accounts on the fly, change the configuration files of Asterisk on the fly, those sorts of things. So that's another thing I strongly recommend that people check. I want to point out just from an architectural standpoint here that when VoIP devices like SIP phones or EEX devices talk to Asterisk and make calls into the Asterisk dial plan, they always come through what we call a channel driver. So the SIP channel driver, for example, speaks the SIP protocol to a SIP device, like Alice's phone in this example, and then translates that into the core of Asterisk, and then Alice's phone would authenticate with the SIP channel driver, and then the SIP channel driver would allow that call to pass on to the dial plan. So again, just as a reminder here, you want to make sure that the accounts that you have in the SIP channel driver configuration are strong. So let me give a couple of examples here. Here's, first of all, a bad example of what an account might look like in SIP.conf or EEX.conf, the channel driver configurations. Here we have an account with a username of 1001 and a password in the secret field down here of 1001. And the other thing I want to point out here is whenever we have one of these accounts, it points to a particular context. You see the line here that says context equals long underscore distance. That's saying what part of the dial plan should that call come into when after the call has been authenticated. In this case, we're giving Alice, if her phone registered with this username and password, her phone would be able to make long distance calls. A better example of an account is over on the right-hand side of this slide, where we've chosen a username that's probably a little bit more difficult to guess. In this case, I've taken the word phone and then a hyphen and the last 6 digits of the MAC address of the phone itself. You notice my secret's a little bit stronger. I've mixed letters and numbers and characters and made it 12 or more characters long. Those are all best practices as far as choosing a password. You also notice at the bottom of that example that I've added an access control list. So I'm saying only allow this phone to connect and make phone calls and authenticate if it's coming from this particular subnet. In this example, the 192.168.55 subnet. The second thing that I talked about on my list of 4 concrete things that we can do is to know your dial plan. Again, when calls come into the dial plan, they come into different contexts. And you will really need to make sure that you're not allowing callers calling in from the outside to be able to make outbound phone calls through your system without your knowledge. The best thing that you can do to ensure that that's not happening is to draw yourself a map of your dial plan and show where are incoming calls coming into, where are phones that are trusted that are authenticating to my system, what context are those coming into, and make sure that you're safe that way. And I'll show an example here on the next slide. A couple other things I want to point out here. Be careful what you put in the context called default. If you use the stock configuration files that come with Asterisk, or use those as a base for creating your own Asterisk configuration files, by default, the SIP channel driver and the EAX channel driver allow unauthenticated calls into the system to come into this default context. Now, that in and of itself is not a security concern unless you go putting other things in that default context that allow outbound dialing. But I want to make sure people are aware of that so that they don't go placing, for example, a pattern match to allow outbound dialing through a SIP trunk into that default context, because then you're allowing anybody to connect to your system without authenticating and then make outbound calls. So again, the best way you can avoid that is to draw yourself a map of your dial plan. And here on this slide, I've got just kind of an example of what your dial plan may look like. It may be different than this depending on how you scripted yours. In this case, I have a set of different contexts, one called international, one called long distance, and one called local, where I point different phones at to give them different classes of service. So in this case, if I pointed Alice's phone at the long distance context, she could call the long distance context, or it includes the local context. That includes the internal context. And there may be an extension in that internal context that calls to Bob's phone, for example. You can see I've got a white cloud at the top. That may be my VoIP provider out there on the network. It's sending calls into my from outside context. So I see that calls coming in from the from outside context come into that green box, that from outside context. From there, they can call internal numbers. They could call to Bob directly, but they can't get out to long distance or local calls or international calls. On the far right-hand side, I also show that untrusted callers, again, unauthenticated callers are going to come into the default context over on the far right-hand side in the red box there. So again, the best thing you can do for your dial plan is just go through your contexts, figure out where they are, look at any include statements or any go-to statements, and figure out where calls can flow through your system, and be careful that way. The third step in my list is to limit your network exposure. A lot of these things have been covered previously, so I won't go into too much detail, but the best thing you can do is remove any unneeded modules from your Asterisk system. If you were to look at the modules that are loaded up in Asterisk, you've probably got between 100 and 150 different modules loaded for various channel drivers, dial plan applications and functions, those sorts of things. Specifically, you may want to go in and